There's a number of things other than taper that determine what happens to your fly line. One is the type of coating it has, another is the core that it has, another is how stiff it is, its sink rate or its floating capabilities, its stretch, and then of course its color. So all those characteristics could determine which fly line you buy. So let's talk about coatings first. Coatings, there's a couple of different pretty common coatings, but the most common is PVC. And the way they get a PVC coating to float is they put a lot of air bubbles in it. So by impregnating that PVC coating with air bubbles, you're going to have your fly line float. A polyurethane coating also is pretty light, so it floats without the air bubbles, and we'll talk about how that's going to float, determining a lot of those fly lines float because of the core that he put in them. And then of course you've got your sinking fly lines that are often polyurethane, PVC I mean, and they're impregnated with some kind of metal. They've got tungsten in them, copper in them, and that determines the rate of sink. The more metal it has in it, the faster it sinks. And of course the smaller diameter it is, because it doesn't need to be as big a diameter to have as much weight. Cores. If we look at cores, there's probably three main kinds of cores. One is braided monofilament, which is just like a rope kind of, and some of these are hollow, in which case they're going to float a little better than ones that are not hollow. And then you've got the braided monofilament that's not hollow, and you've got the single monofilament core. So those are going to determine the stretch rate, the floating rate, and you know how well they recover under different temperatures. You've probably pulled out a tropical fly line, for instance, and you try to use it in Minnesota in the spring, and it's like a slinky. You can't get the curls out of it. That's because it's probably made with some kind of a monofilament core that's really stiff, just like a leader that you take out of a package in cold weather is going to be really hard to stiffen. So you need to think about the kind of core you have before, and the kind of coating to some extent, but especially the core before you decide where you're going to fish. For instance, I fish in Tampa Bay in the winter. I don't use tropical or even saltwater lines. I use striper lines, I use musky lines, I use pike lines, because they have the kind of tapers I might want, but they have a much more supple core. They have Dacron or some similar kinds of things as a core, which is really flexible. Even Dacron almost frozen is still going to not have much memory. And so that's really good. If you use a saltwater hide, you know, something that's designed for really, really hot weather, like a tropical redfish line here, when the air temperature might be 50 and the water temperature is 60, you're going to be throwing a slinky. And it's going to be really tough to get the curls out of it, and you won't be able to shoot the line very good. So the kind of core you have is important to understand. Get the core that's going to fit your temperature most universally. Polyurethane, by the same token, doesn't seem to have quite so much problem, especially if you use braided, if you use nylon or Dacron or something for a core. So find out how much that's going to be a consideration, and we'll talk about that when you go to buy a fly line. Stiffness, we just talked about that. Stiffness is determined not only by the kind of coating you have, but also by the type of core that you have in the middle. And then sink rate, that's going to be determined, we talked about, by how much metal you have in the core. And of course, some people are concerned about color. I like a brighter color so I can see it, especially when I have a lot of, in Wyoming, if I'm saltwater fishing, it's not that important. I like blue lines, some kind of line that's going to kind of match the background in the sky, maybe a grayish line for cloudy days, that kind of thing. But in Wyoming, I like a bright line because under poor light, I can see where my men's are. And so, you know, I use a bright line. You go to New Zealand, they don't want you to use any bright lines because they spook fish. I'm not entirely sure that's true. But consider the fly line. I just don't think that's as big an issue as some people make it out to be. But certainly it can be an issue in certain circumstances. We're going to talk about the relationship between a fly line and the reel for a second. You know, fly lines come in anywhere between 90 and 120 feet. The truth is, there's no real reason to have a fly line that's 120 feet long unless you're in a distance contest. Even a 90-foot fly line for a lot of applications just isn't required. A lot of my fly lines, for instance, if I'm using a fly line in Wyoming, I'll take that fly line and I'll cut 15 or 20 feet of the running line off. That way I can put it on a smaller reel. And when I put it on a smaller reel, the smaller the reel, the easier it is to cast. Because when you go to cast that reel, this causes momentum. It's hard to stop the reel, which is going to cause you to have a poor loop potentially. And it's going to be more fatiguing. So the smaller the reel you can use, the better. The other thing that we'll get into in one of the other videos is how to set the drag. And the smaller the diameter that you're trying to rotate through as the fly line gets pulled out, the more drag you're going to have regardless of how you set the drag. So I like to use as small a reel as I possibly can with as small a line as I can. And especially in Wyoming, I'm using lines with a very supple core. These lines are supple. Even at low degrees, low temperatures, 40, 30, 50 degrees, they're not going to curl and kink and act like a slinky, even when they're wrapped around a very small diameter reel. And that's kind of what you might want to think about too, is what are you going to use this fly line for? You know, if you're going to be using this fly line and making big long casts, you might want to keep that whole rear taper on, not the rear taper, but the entire running line on there. For me, that running line is oftentimes really just an excess that I don't need that gets in the way of doing some things I'd rather be doing. So consider that. It's a possibility. Also consider the fact that a large arbor reel, in other words, a reel that's wider, it's not going to be a more efficient reel at reeling fish in than a narrow. It's going to be the diameter of the spool that's going to determine how fast you can reel a fish in. So consider all that stuff and consider the length of your line and whether you really need the line or not. And I'm not telling you to butcher your lines. Most people shudder to think about that, but it is something to think about because you can get all your line on a much smaller reel. And if you don't need backing, you don't need to put back. I've got lots of little trout reels, 3 and 4 weight reels with supple lines that I don't even have backing on. I mean, I'm fishing for, 18-inch fish at the most. Most of them are 10 inches, 7 inches, and they're not going anywhere because I'm in a little bitty stream. So think about all that stuff when you buy a fly line. So which fly line do I buy? Let's talk about somebody who lives in Pennsylvania, and they're going to fish for brook trout in small streams. They're probably going to buy a 3 or 4 weight fly line. They're going to buy a fly line that's got a very supple core. They're going to buy a fly line with a relatively long front taper, maybe 6-7 foot front taper, so they can still turn over if occasionally they want to use a woolly bugger or a woolly worm or something. They can turn it over as long as it doesn't have too much weight, but it's going to deliver a dry fly very nicely. If that same fisherman decides he's going to go someplace and fish for pike in Canada, then he might need a bigger fly line, maybe an 8 weight, because that 8 weight fly line is going to be much more able to hold up in the wind because it's got more mass. And it's also going to be able to turn over bugs. So let's say you're going to go fish for pike and you're going to use 5-inch, big old 5-inch flies. You're going to need a short front taper, maybe 3-4 feet. That's all you need. And you're going to need a fairly heavy fly line, like an 8, in order to turn that over. And you're also going to need a fly line that's got a very supple core, or a fairly supple core, especially if you're fishing in the fall and the spring when the water temperatures are cold and the air temperatures are cold. Now, let's say that same fisherman, he's going to go take a trip to the Bahamas and he's going to fish for bonefish. He needs a fly line with a fairly long head on it. In other words, he's going to need a fairly long, maybe a 5 or 6 foot front taper. He's going to need maybe a 15-foot belly and maybe a 15 or 20 foot rear taper so he can make casts to 60 feet fairly accurately with fairly large sized bugs. The same guy is going to go fish for let's say tarpon or redfish, and he's going to need to make fairly short casts, very fast, especially redfish. You're going to need to make and you're going to do that in the middle of the summer when water temperatures are 90 degrees, air temperatures are 95. You got to make a fast cast in a big hurry. You're going to want maybe a 30-foot head. You're going to want a 3 or 4 foot front taper. You're going to want a stiff core that's not going to just wimp out on you when it gets super hot. And that's what you're going to want because you don't care. You're not going to be casting 60, 70 feet. You're going to load that rod in 1 or 2 false casts and blast it. So you need to think about when you go in, as far as color, I don't know, that kind of depends. Most of the saltwater lines are sort of bluish, grayish, that kind of color. Freshwater lines are anywhere from orange to yellow to bright green. Again, I think mostly for the reasons that you can see the mends in them better, especially when there's glare. But in saltwater, you're not mending very much, so it doesn't really matter. So consider all of that stuff. If you want to make a lot of curve casts and reach mends, especially curve casts under docks and between mangroves, you need something with a short front taper on it so that that fly turns over. When you stop that rod, that fly turns over and just flies at a right angle to your fly line into or under those things you're looking for. So the kind of fishing you do is going to determine what kind of fly line you get. So think about that, and if you have one or two things that you do most frequently, 90% of the time, get a fly line for that. And it's like everything else. Not every boat is the best boat for all situations. Not every pair of shoes is the best pair of shoes for all situations. Not every rod. It's the same thing with fly lines. A lot of differences in fly lines. You just have to decide what price you're going to pay for the kind of fly line that you want and what you're giving up for that fly line. I hope this helped a little bit and it makes you a little bit more of an informed consumer.